My birthday's coming up. I'm going to be 56, I think. 57, 56. I don't know. Done a lot of hard things in life. I suppose we all have. I adopted 4 kids. I quit my job to go into ministry. I went back to school to get my master's and doctoral degrees in ministry. I got a patent. I wrote a book. Working on my second book. That's really hard. I started a cattle business from scratch. I left ministry. That was hard. That was really hard. I preached at my dad's funeral. It's hard. But what's really hard, at 56 years old, or whatever I am, I've discovered that what's really hard is following Jesus. Being a Christian, that's easy. Going to church, that's easy. Following Jesus, that's not easy. There's a difference. In Philippians 2, Paul kind of paints that difference out for us. He says, you're supposed to do nothing out of selfish ambition. That's what it looks like to follow Jesus. You're supposed to do nothing out of selfish ambition. Dude, everything I do is out of selfish ambition, somehow. Paul says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, which excludes, obviously, most politicians, by the way, excludes all of us. He says, instead, in humility, you're supposed to consider others better than yourselves. Who do you mean by others that I have to consider better than myself? Are you talking about Democrats? Do I got to consider Democrats better than myself? Or Republicans? Don't tell me I got to consider Republicans better than myself. What about homosexuals or sinners? What about sinners, transgender people, drag queens? Them too? All of them I got to consider better than myself? Each of you, Paul says, should look out not only to your own interests, but also the interests of others. What about people who are not deserving of me looking out for their interests? What about people like immigrants? Or worse yet, illegal immigrants, people breaking into my country from shithole countries, trying to take my stuff. Do I got to look out for their interests? They're illegals. They don't deserve that. That doesn't seem fair, does it? It seems like Jesus would be all about sort of a fairness sort of perspective. Of course, Paul says, in fact, the opposite. Jesus embraced the unfairness of looking out to the interests of others, especially those who don't deserve it. Your attitude, Paul says, should be the same as Christ Jesus, which is almost never the case. Your attitude, he says, should be that of Christ Jesus. Your attitude, the one who, in being very nature God, this is what your attitude should be like, Rick. The one who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. He was willing to set it aside. He made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. He humbled himself, even becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. That's what your attitude, Rick. That's what your attitude should be like. The one who had every right to be God, setting aside his own rights to be God for people who didn't deserve it. People, in fact, out to do him harm. That's what your attitude should be like, Rick. God had every right to crush us, but God gave up those rights to crush us and accepted instead a crushing from us. And that's what your attitude should be like. It's un-American. In America, we have rights. And we protect our rights. And we defend our rights. And you better not try and take away my rights. especially if you're not somebody who deserves it, somebody who's done me wrong. Our rights to own a gun, our rights to not wear a mask if we don't feel like it, our right to work if we feel like working, our right to not work. These are our rights. And we have every right to protect our country and our jobs from anybody who's trying to steal our rights. Those are our rights, yet the very image of God, the very attitude Paul says we have to take, is to follow after somebody who set aside all of the rights that he had and set them aside specifically for people who didn't deserve it. Folks, we can say we're following Jesus, but if our life doesn't look like that, if our attitude is not looking like that, if our passion is not finding ways to actually set aside our rights for people who don't deserve it, then we're not following Jesus. We might be following some other guy who says he's following Jesus, but it's not Jesus. The question then becomes, especially if we want to try following Jesus, the question then becomes, who are we really following? And that, my friends, is a hard question.